Hi, and welcome to a presentation on borderline personality disorder. My name is Yvonne Tarleton, and I work at the Department of Psychology at Cheeverstown. And I'm hoping to give you an understanding of what borderline personality disorder is, where it comes from, how to understand it, and how to work with people who have borderline personality disorder. So you might have heard of the term personality disorder before. Um, there's a whole range of personality disorders that you can see there. Um, Today we're going to be focusing on borderline personality disorder. But just to say generally that there are quite a few different types. And these problems that are described in terms of defining personality disorder are often based on um, normal issues that people face. So, a little bit of a health warning that some of these things that I'm going to describe might seem familiar, either in people you know or people close to you or in people yourself. But the difference between kind of features of the personality disorder and actually having a personality disorder is that when a person has a personality disorder, they affect their main areas of living really severely. So that would be their work, they probably wouldn't be able to work, and that they would have very huge difficulty in having relationships, and kind of close intimate relationships, and also friendships or any kind of social life. Um, to be creative in any way, and it would hugely impact on their internal well-being and general enjoyment of life most of the time, to quite a severe degree. So just a bit of a health warning when you hear the description of the different features of personality disorder. So a key component or feature of personality disorder is a complete absence of a sense of self, and that means that people with personality disorder really have trouble in um, understanding who they are, or um, finding that meaning in life for themselves. Most people might have some difficulty with this or some uncertainty around this, particularly when they're young, but it's quite different to a person with a personality disorder, where it's completely absent, or they might even have trouble describing who they are, even in simple terms, or even maybe knowing their likes or dislikes. And this can be really confusing for them, and it can be one of the reasons why they might really struggle when times are difficult, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. And with that, then also a complete absence of understanding other people and other people's meaning in life, and seeing that kind of bigger picture, especially when it comes to other people. So, for example, someone, a staff member, might have been working with someone for years and kind of worked really hard to do the best that they could for them, but mightn't be able to give them something in that moment or meet a demand that a service user with personality difficulties has, and that'll be all that'll count. It'll be really hard for that person to think back to the other times, or to see the bigger picture, or to have it kind of what forms the basis of most relationships is the kind of the bigger picture, or the meaning overall. And while it's kind of normal to get frustrated if you um, can't get something in the moment, it's quite different to not being able to uh, figure out at all a relationship with a person and just be completely reactive to what's happening in that moment. And this is another reason why um, people with personality disorders find it really hard to have those relationships, or to profit in any way from a relationship, to build that over time and to get joy from it. And that's really difficult, or impossible for people with personality disorders, in the most extreme cases. So it's reasonably uncommon to have a personality disorder in around 10% of the population for all personality disorders. And again, that's bearing in mind that these problems are to the extent that they're completely stopping someone from functioning in a workplace, in their social life, or in relationships in general. So that's just about 10%, and about 1% of those people would have borderline personality disorder. Um, in ID, it's a little bit higher than that in working with people with intellectual disabilities. And it's not totally clear why this might happen, and we might get a better sense of this when we look at the reasons why someone might develop a personality disorder. And again, the figures for borderline personality disorder are higher than in the general population, so around just under 10%. Um, and uh, again, that's usually because of different traumas that happen to people um, uh, in the development, in their early development. And someone with an intellectual disability might experience more trauma than someone in the general population, and this be a likely reason why this is the case. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of the understanding of the reasons why someone has a personality disorder. It's generally more common in females, but actually, for various different reasons, sometimes it's more obvious in females, so it's more likely to be diagnosed in females. And most people who have borderline personality disorder will have another disorder, so another psychopathology, or meet the criteria for one. So that could be usually a mood disorder, like anxiety or depression, and that's usually because the way that their life goes, or how difficult life is for them, really impacts on them then in another way. So it makes sense that if someone is really bad at managing their relationships to the point where they don't really have any friends or other big relationships in their life, that would really impact their mood and how they feel. So it makes sense that generally one kind of goes with the other. So just something to bear in mind again as I'm going through the features of borderline personality disorder is to remember that the problem is there to the extent that it severely is impacting on areas of life. So the common areas like relationships, either intimate relationships or friendships, social life, and the ability to kind of work or engage meaningfully in society in some way. So again, one of the core features for borderline personality disorder is a really poor sense of self or self-image. And usually this is something that will develop, and that most people will have some difficulty in their formative years, maybe figuring out who they are or what they stand for. But this is quite different to someone with borderline personality disorder. So someone with this difficulty will really have no idea who they are, or no idea of what they stand for, and that could change day to day depending on what's in front of them. But generally, they might not even be able to describe themselves or describe their personality, or even what they like or dislike. They might have no idea about this, that sense of identity, who you are and where you come from and your values. So that's really difficult then in navigating life, because that can usually keep you quite anchored when you have a bit of that bit of meaning in life. So that's the kind of the cause of a lot of the difficulties that people with borderline personality disorder have. And then with that is a complete lack of understanding of other people and other people's meaning in life, and no kind of permanent idea of other people. So that could mean that you could be working with a client for years and years, and have done what you felt was really good work with them, but they might react really strongly to something that just happened in one moment in time, and that's because they're not really able to take in the bigger picture, or the kind of the whole past, present, and future of your relationship with them. They can't, they don't have a memory for that. They can't really, a lot of the terms might be that they can't really profit or get the good from that relationship, because they're so dependent on just what's in front of them. It's like having no memory at all, or no idea of figuring out the future. So their ability to assess other people properly is really, really bad, and that actually makes them really vulnerable, because in one sense, they can't really kind of think back or take in the bigger picture of a person generally being quite good to them over time, or someone who's tried to help them a lot. And also, it can make them vulnerable to kind of bad people or predators who might kind of display. They might do them a good deed, or to give them something good in the moment. But they might have had no relationship with them, or no built up sense of trust, so they can be quite vulnerable to just what's happening in the here and now, as opposed to taking in the bigger picture of those relationships with other people. So, along with a poor sense of self, someone with borderline personality disorder will have a really limited ability for reflective capacity. So, a reflective capacity means that ability to take stock about who you are, or kind of what's going on with yourself, or to understand how your behavior might affect your own life, or different things that are going on. And that can be hard for a lot of people, especially if they're feeling a high level of emotion. But most people might be able to, even with a little bit of help, to kind of figure out their own behavior and different things that they might say and do that mightn't be helping them in the long term. Even if they can't fix it, they might have the ability to see that. Whereas someone with borderline personality disorder won't have any idea about what's going on, what they're doing to make something make life a bit more difficult for them. And how you might see this is that someone might be causing themselves all sorts of problems in terms of their relationships with their friends, or with staff, and in their workplace, or whatever they might be doing day to day, but they would have absolutely no ability to see how they might be contributing to that, or how they might be able to do things differently. It's kind of like a huge blind spot, and it's usually other people that can kind of see what's going on, and maybe encourage them to go for a bit of therapy, or to get a bit of extra help. They usually won't be going to look for help with it, because that's how limited their understanding of that they would even have something that they could be helped with to make things better. They might know that they feel really bad, or that things are really bad, but they wouldn't be able to join the dots or make that connection at all. So again, a big problem for someone with borderline personality disorder is seeing the bigger picture, or finding that bit of meaning in life that can really help us navigate the ups and downs, or the disappointments or frustrations that we have. It's really hard for someone with borderline personality disorder to tolerate feelings of discomfort or frustration, and they might kind of completely lose it. For something that other people might consider quite small, or that someone else might be able to manage a little bit better. So they'd be relying on those primitive defenses, and that means kind of things that a much younger person might do. So when a young baby or a child becomes frustrated that they can't get their way, or that something isn't working out, they might go be screaming or crying, or very, very upset, and have those real raw primitive defenses, as opposed to someone who's a little bit older, who might be a bit sad about it, but they might be able to manage that a lot better, and they might feel more nuanced feelings like shame or disappointment, but they might be able to integrate that into a bigger picture. Someone with borderline personality disorder would really kind of regress right back to that really raw emotion, for the smallest of things day to day in life. And again, that's causing big problems, because it causes them to really lose it, and it's kind of like a big volcano that it's really hard to come back when you've exploded like that. And then it also causes problems for other people, because other people, including maybe people that they live with, or maybe people working with them, find that really hard to tolerate when someone's constantly showing a lot of emotion um, for things day to day, and it's very exhausting for people. That's another core feature. Um, and then, so that will lead to a lot of fighting and aggression with people if they're just kind of losing it for every little thing that happens with them day to day. And then that can also, unfortunately, that anger can turn against themselves. So a really common aspect of borderline personality disorder is self-harm. So it could be cutting or hurting a person's self in some way. Um, and it might be feeling suicidal, so that real rage against themselves. Um, so this constant up and downs, and then another time a person they might be able to lift out of that and feel quite happy if things are going their way. So it's really up and down, and it can often look quite like bipolar disorder. Lots of kind of well-known famous people have come out and said that they used to have they were previously diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but they actually found out it was borderline personality disorder, because that's kind of what their day to day can look like. Lots of these ups and downs happening. So there's no one set reason why someone would develop borderline personality disorder, and it's generally agreed that it's through a variety of different kind of unfortunate events in life that someone might arrive at finding themselves with this experience. So genetics do play a part. Um, kind of someone's temperament might be genetically predisposed to having that, um, but it's thought that a bigger part or a bigger role is played by a person's relationships, and they can be their early relationships, so their attachment relationship, which is known, which is the term you might have heard before to describe a parent and child relationship that gives a person a blueprint for their relationships later in life, um, and then other relationships that they go on to develop, where they might learn unhelpful ways of being, particularly any type of abuse, and particularly sex abuse is dominant for people with borderline personality disorder. Um, so any kind of, usually there's some kind of relationship trauma there. So someone's been really hurt in some way in their relationships in the past. But it's not likely to be any one of these things on their own. Usually people who have borderline personality disorder has a long history of poor learning and poor reinforcement from their environment. So if we think about what these type of environmental factors might be, one of the biggest predictors of a borderline personality disorder is neglect. And if you think about the difficulties with someone that someone with borderline personality disorder has in terms of understanding and managing their emotions and understanding other people, they're quite similar to that of quite a small child, even though they might seem mature and intelligent in other ways. In terms of those very basic emotions, that they might seem much younger in themselves, and it might feel like the exhaustion of managing a younger child. And that makes sense when you think about that. If as a child they weren't helped to manage those feelings or to move through that developmental stage, to navigate that with the parent, if they were totally neglected and kind of left to maybe cry or left to manage things on their own. And so say if their parents were maybe unwell themselves, or just didn't have the capacity to parent them in a good enough way, in a way that was good enough for them to develop, then that will be a huge factor in them developing a personality disorder. And of course, adverse life effects and trauma is something you probably hear an awful lot about. So a big trauma, something really big that happens in someone's life, or it could be lots of little traumas. So it could be lots of small different disappointments or throughout childhood that add up. So big T's or lots and lots of smaller T's, and especially in terms of relationships. So it could be very traumatizing for a child not to have their needs met or to be loved and nurtured by their parents in a way that's just good enough. It wouldn't have to be a perfect childhood that someone had, but it's quite different if there's a long-standing pattern of a parent neglecting them. So a lack of consistency in those early relationships. So a child who has a long-standing experience of a parent, maybe sometimes they're there for them, but maybe half the time they're not there for them, or they might lash out at them, or not be able to parent them in a way that's reasonably consistent. And obviously no parent is perfect, but in a way that's reasonably stable or mature. And that could be because of lots of different reasons, like mentioned before. Parents themselves may have experienced abuse, or they may themselves have not had that nurturing childhood, or they might have been in maybe abusive relationships, or they might have had addiction problems, or there's usually some reason why a parent hasn't been able to provide this nurturing for their child. Particularly in terms of emotions. So if you think about someone with borderline personality disorder, a lot of their difficulty is in managing their emotions and being able to calm themselves down, and that's a skill that you learn as a child. Most children can't calm themselves down at all, and they're totally reactive to what's happening. That's quite similar to someone with borderline personality disorder. So if you can think of it in a way that it's that emotional regulation skill that wasn't learned. So overall, these core childhood needs not being met, and not being worked through at the right time, has left a person vulnerable to these difficulties. So if we think about the core needs emotionally that a child would have, they're usually have not been developed in someone with borderline personality. So they might have had they mightn't have been neglected in a way that might seem like abuse. They might have been clothed and they might have been fed, but those emotional needs, like feeling safe and getting that love and nurture and praise and attention and empathy from a parent who really understands you, and understands what it's like for you as a child, and that validation, so that you can build up a sense of feeling good enough in who you are. So chances are that someone with borderline personality disorder hasn't had those emotional experiences, so experienced emotional neglect in these areas. So if we think about why it might be more common to have borderline personality for people with ID, so if we think back to those figures where it's 8.5% roughly of people with ID, as opposed to just 1% of the general population. Unfortunately, usually people with ID will have more experiences of abuse and neglect in their childhood, or are more at risk. Usually their parents are going through a hugely difficult time around the time that they're born and in their early years. So that might really affect how they are able to parent their child emotionally, if they're really struggling to come to terms with the disability themselves. And actually, it might be really hard also for them to build that relationship if they don't really understand their child, or if they find it harder to understand their child. And the parent might even become depressed themselves, or really just be struggling in a whole range of different ways. And that might impact on their ability to to give the child what they need in terms of those needs that we were looking at in the last slide. So it can be really hard to work with someone who has borderline personality disorder, and because the nature of their problems is in their relationships, building a relationship with them then is understandably really tough. So there's a few different things to think about in relation to this. So first of all, people with borderline personality disorder really feel things in extremes. So things can be really, really good or really, really bad. And it can be kind of up and down like this. And that can also relate to staff. So they can have staff who they really think are the bee's knees and totally brilliant, and then other staff who they think are terrible and have really extreme feelings about. And that can be really exhausting for the people who they get along really well with, and then also really difficult for people who they don't get along well with. So it's really important that this is talked about amongst staff, and that there's that space for thinking about what's going on and that space for reflection, and to not feed into these roles too much. Because it's up to staff to kind of hold the middle ground there, that most people are doing their best, and it's normal enough to have people who they might slightly favour, but that most people are doing their best, and not to encourage this type of behaviour. And it's called splitting into all good and all bad. And sometimes if staff aren't really aware that this might be what's happening, they might split and kind of turn against each other, or find it really difficult to work together, and start to develop really extreme feelings as well about the client. So some people might rush in and really feel like they need to rescue the person and do all that they can to help them and really go above and beyond. And then other people might really have a negative attitude towards the client, so see them as really manipulative or demanding, or selfish. So just to be really aware of, and to watch for yourself and having those extreme views, because they're usually in a reaction to someone with borderline personality disorder. And it's worthwhile just stopping and thinking about how you're feeling, if you start to get really sucked into any of those extreme positions, because it's a real theme, this extreme ways, and it's quite exhausting to be dealing with all of this a lot of the time. So it's important to self-care for yourself as a staff member, and to be aware of what's going on in a way that maybe the client can't be. So if they can't be aware, or they can't really understand their own behaviour and other people's behaviour, then it's up to staff to kind of work hard to have that understanding on their behalf. And even if you can't help a person to manage their extremes, and then just to at least manage maybe your reactions to them, so that your reactions aren't too extreme. And you can do that through communicating really well with each other, and being really consistent in your approach, and also through getting supervision. And if you feel really overwhelmed, or if you feel like you've gotten sucked into kind of a toxic enough situation, that you can make a referral to psychology to help manage that, and to help get support for staff in those situations. So just a few examples there of some of the really extreme thoughts that someone with borderline personality disorder has. So that theme of things being really extremely good, like perfect, and people as well being amazing, or people being awful and the worst thing ever. So kind of like a seesaw between one or the other, with no middle balanced ground. And then kind of a really poor, again back to that poor understanding of relationships, or poor ability to build gradual relationships with gaining people's trust. So really feeling that other people won't be there for them, or that they will leave them, and wanting to stay in charge. So needing to be in complete control of everything, because because of worrying about really extreme consequences of things going wrong. So always in that extreme of really either all good or all bad, whereas actually most of life and most of things that happen are kind of somewhere in the middle. Um, so because people with borderline personality disorder don't really have a good sense of who they are, and they don't really have that sense of their own identity, they might adapt their behavior all the time to suit other people. So constantly be changing and constantly trying to make other people happy and be who other people want them to be. And that's really exhausting for them. And then they can be really harsh on themselves. And I think that they're really bad things about themselves if they feel rejected or if they feel like a negative emotion from another people. So just some of the really extreme thoughts that might be there, or that you might come across in working with people. So being around somebody who has these really extreme ways of viewing the world and extreme emotions all the time can feel like really hard to work with, really frustrating and unfair, and sometimes punitive on you as a staff member. If things don't go their way, or if they fall out with you, it can feel really extreme. And then it can also be really exhausting if you're kind of the good one, or if you're really put on that pedestal. That can also be tiring as well. Um, and because you're in a closer relationship with the person who has difficulty in relationships, you might feel like unfairly put um, in the focus of their anger. Um, and they may even make accusations against you. So people with borderline personality disorder can experience things that are really, if you're trying to help them, or really well-meaning things, as an attack. And it's because of that lack of understanding of other people. So lack of being able to understand what's going on. Um, that kind of common sense that a lot of people have with relationships, of someone's intentions. So even if someone might say or do the wrong thing, you might know that their intentions are good. So someone with borderline personality disorder might not have that. So you might feel really unfairly treated by them. And it's really important to maintain, if this is happening, to first of all to communicate with other people about it, so to get some help in that way, and to just maintain your empathy for that person. It doesn't mean that you have to accept their behavior, it doesn't mean that you have to tolerate abuse yourself, of course, but just to understand why they might be doing it, or where it might come from. And to try not to react harshly in return, and to try to manage your reactions. But that's not an easy thing to do, and you need to help with that usually to kind of unpack everything that's going on. So if you find yourself in one of these situations, it's always a good idea to go to other staff members who've been there for a while, or a person in charge, or you can always make a referral to psychology for support with this. So just some tips there in working with someone who has borderline personality disorder. So the first thing is to really take the pressure off yourself to fix or change a person. And there are no quick fixes to a person with borderline personality disorder and the difficulties they face. And it's through little things actually that you actually are is possible to make a change with them. So if they feel safe in their relationship with you as a staff, that's a huge starting point. So that means that maybe if they're having a bad day, or if they say something to you that they may have lashed out or didn't mean, that you won't leave them, or that you won't give them this huge rejection. If you're there for them, and you'll be perfectly within your rights to tell them when something isn't acceptable, or whatever it might be. But to create that safeness would be huge, so that they feel like you're not going to reject them, because they probably had an awful lot of rejections throughout their life, in terms of friendships or people who aren't tolerating their behavior. So if you can, depending on the person's capabilities, to help them understand what's going on, and that can be on a really basic level. So they might not be able to understand the ins and outs of everything that's happening, but if they can even understand that they're feeling angry, that's a huge starting point, because the person may not even understand those very basic emotions that they're feeling. So you can get a bit of help with this from psychology to develop support plans to help them understand their emotions, but you'll be able to identify that you're feeling angry because you missed a phone call from your mother today. So something really simple for them being able to link the feeling to what's happened to them can be helpful, because they probably can't do that for themselves, and to remember that. And then if the person really can't understand, if there's absolutely no capability for them to understand these emotions, then just to manage your own reactions. Um, and that doesn't mean that you have to be really nice to them all the time if they're really horrible to you, but just to manage that you're not lashing back at them. So and that's a really hard thing to do if someone's if you feel someone's being really extreme in their reactions to you. But usually taking some time out, taking a breather, and kind of remembering that you're just there to help them in this moment in time, and it's not personal. So usually with these, even though it might seem really extreme with borderline personality disorder, usually a lot of the difficulties they have in relationships, it's not about you and it's not personal to you. It's more to do with them and their background, as we've discussed before, and to just have that compassionate stance. So sometimes if you're feeling really frustrated, to kind of read over a person's file, or to ask another staff member, God, what happened to them, or what's their background, can really help you understand why they might be acting the way that they're acting, and to really be compassionate about how hard life is for them, to be the energy that it takes to feel all of these emotions all the time and to not really understand what's going on. These really kind of simple things, but they're actually really hard to do in the moment when you're working with someone. So peer support and kind of debriefs on situations, and then also help from management and psychology if necessary, can be helpful in navigating that. So, a good place to start and somewhere to go to if you feel like you're struggling in working with someone who has these difficulties is to validate them. And it might seem really simple, but actually, this might be an experience that they didn't really get that much of. So, it can feel really positive to them. So you don't have to agree with the extremes of why they're feeling. So say, for example, they mightn't have been able to go on a certain trip that they wanted to because there weren't enough staff available. So you might be kind of thinking, well, I don't agree with this person getting so angry or so upset about that. It's not really important to agree with them, but you can maybe see the emotion that they're having and understand maybe why they're having that emotion. So just to kind of say something like, I see that you're really angry, and I understand that you're really angry because you didn't get to go on that trip today, and that's really hard for you. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with their reaction, but just the fact that you can see and understand where they're coming from, even if it seems extreme. And a good way to maintain this understanding is to keep understanding about how hard life is for them because of that lack of understanding of themselves and their own emotions and other people, and all those extremes that they're feeling. So if you can do this as genuinely as possible, that can be really powerful for the other person. And again, just not an experience that they get very often. So a real skill to be able to validate them, and to really empathize and understand with them, regardless of, again, whether you agree with it or not. So just some specific tips on things you can do when working with someone with borderline personality disorder. So as best you can and as humanly possible, to stay out of judgment. And the best way to do that is to maintain an understanding of why a person might be acting the way that they're acting. And that means why in terms of their history, and then why also in the moment. So what's causing them to be upset or angry or whatever it might be. And for you, they'll be able to sense from you if you're not judging them in the moment, and that's really helpful and therapeutic for them. So if you're becoming the target of criticisms or accusations, it's really important to not fight back and not kind of lash back at that. And that's really hard because, you know, it can feel really extreme and what you're on the end of, and you might really want to defend yourself in that moment. Um, but as best you can, I think taking a step back, taking a few minutes to yourself to kind of ground yourself back in your own reality, um, within this, and to remember that it's really not personal, that it's really not about you, and it's more about the person's ability to manage themselves and their own emotions and the relationships that they're in. Um, However, it is really important that we always take seriously anything with regards to self harm or suicidal gestures, like attempts, or talk about that. So we can never ignore that, even if we do feel that it's for attention. So not to panic and not to react, and to stay as calm as possible, but to make sure to raise it with other staff and your manager, person in charge, and the relevant clinical teams, because even if you do feel like a person isn't intending to actually do anything, and they're just using it to get the focus of attention on them, that could still lead to a very serious situation, or even suicide itself. Sometimes attempts that don't mean to go anywhere can actually lead to that, so we need to take everything seriously. um, and a really helpful thing that you can maybe say to someone is that if they really feel seen in how much pain that they're in, so to really recognize that the reason that someone's doing that, regardless of their intentions or not, is because they're in an awful lot of pain, and there's something that you're trying to tell them. So if you can let them know that you see that, and you see how hard it is for them, even if you don't agree with the reasons behind it, or the how serious they're taking it, maybe can agree with how they're feeling in that moment. So listening is a huge thing that you can do, and it's kind of what most people want, is to be heard, and to really have someone understand their feelings. And that might have been something that someone with borderline personality disorder didn't get enough of when they were younger, so they might really need extra listening time and extra understanding from staff, um, and really recognizing the emotion that they're feeling. um, so yeah, so it is important to not tolerate abuse, um, and to work with other staff, to try to stay calm in the situation, and not react or become defensive, um, and maybe find the staff or the person in charge to come back and talk about the issue later, and try to not react in the moment when you're feeling emotional, or you might feel really hurt yourself, and to come back when you're feeling a bit calmer, to manage that. So again, just touching on some of the things that we've already mentioned there, in terms of working with someone with borderline personality disorder. So because they might find it really difficult to be flexible or to move through different situations, it's really important that you can do that, as a staff member, and try to make the person feel as safe as possible. Um, and to let them know the different rules. So it's okay to have rules and boundaries and set limits in terms of working with them, um, and to really avoid that splitting that we were talking about earlier. So good staff and bad staff, and really extreme views. And the best way to do that is to make sure that you're all working together and thinking about how you're working, instead of maybe taking up those roles. If someone maybe puts you in that role of really bad or really good, to kind of then together work to make sure that you all actually get along as a staff team. together, and to just keep that own awareness of your own feelings. So if you're feeling something, to really think about it and maybe even write it down, and maybe write down what's happening in that moment to come back to later and try to make sense of. Um, and then to be compassionate, as we said earlier, to clients and to understand their difficulties, but also to be compassionate to yourself and to your other colleagues, and to remember that this is really hard. You're being asked to have a relationship with someone who finds it really difficult to have relationships and who has a long-standing history of difficulties in relationships. So it's understandable if you find it really tiring or unmanageable at times, but by working together as staff and to link into the supports that are available through your managers or through psychology, you can work really well in this situation. So just to cover again what you can do as a staff member. So the team approach is the most important thing, and to notice if you start to have troubles in your team, or that splitting kind of comes to your team where maybe members of team aren't getting along, or different things are happening, that can be a time to get a bit of help from a supervisor, and that could be your manager, or maybe someone in psychology could help facilitate that, and to recognize as well that it's normal to maybe experience difficulties as a team. It's really common if you're working with someone who does have a personality disorder for that then to trickle through to your team. So there's no need to kind of cover it up or try to manage it yourself. Getting a bit of help from the outside is the best way to cope with that, and to try to be as consistent as possible. And if someone on your team is maybe finding it really hard, that they might have the space to make sure to support each other to take a step back. And that could even just be stepping outside for some fresh air, or getting themselves a cup of tea if they've had a really difficult interaction. So it can be small things like that that can really help manage it day to day. And to remember that you're not the problem owner. You're not the person who has to solve and hold this problem. You're just helping a person who has this difficulty or has this problem. So remember that how hard this job is and how skilled this work is, that you're really requiring to dig down deep and be resilient when things are difficult, and to hold this understanding and flexibility for the person. That's a really hard and skillful piece of work that you're doing. So to take a pride in that, that maybe the other person, the person that you're working with who has a personality disorder hasn't been able to experience that in their other relationships, and other people have found it really hard. But for you to try your best at achieving that for them is really skillful work. So thank you for listening to the presentation on working with people with borderline personality disorder. If you feel like you need that support, or if you have any questions about anything that we've covered here in this presentation, then please do get in touch. You can find my email address in the Cheeverstown system, ytarleton@cheeverstown.ie. Thank you.